All right, we are recording, so we can start. I love it how I can move my hands real fast and you can't see them. I got arms. So, final week, uh, week 5 of part 5, top 5 centers of all time in the NBA. Does this mean I start? Because it's now
Yep.
an
Yeah,
odd
because I
number.
did it last week.
So, um, obviously, last week we had a nice little mini debate that Tim Duncan is a center or a power forward, and StatMuse says center. So obviously, I'm going to have Tim Duncan on my list somewhere. I'll give you that spoiler right now, which obviously means our list is probably going to be at least one position different. I guess I had a couple players that I had to really I thought about and that didn't make the cut at number 5. First one was the Dream. Hakeem was like, oh, I think I was like, surely I want to put him on this list, but like, he didn't make my 5. Sorry, mate. Just 2 rings and a great Hall of Fame career, but you're just not top 5, I don't think. And David Robinson was obviously up there as well. Definitely obviously Hall of Fame career there as well. And just before Tim Duncan came along, so he missed the cut too. So at number 5, I was actually a little bit torn where to put this player, because at times when I've talked about centers, I've listed him first on my list probably like 10 years ago, by sheer virtue of all the rings that he's won, 11, all right, in total. But obviously, there's not much stats on him. And that's been a huge challenge. It's funny. I was trying to pull some stats up on him, and for some reason, I maybe it's just like videos or someone said something, but everyone feels Bill Russell was obviously not the biggest scorer, but obviously a great defensive presence, grabbed lots of rebounds, and obviously probably really sort of patrolled the paint, and obviously blocked a bunch of shots. But there's no real stats that I can find that actually back that up. So I guess for this list, I have Bill Russell at number 5.
I have Bill Russell on my list, maybe just a tiny bit higher. Look, one of the hardest parts there is 11 rings is really impressive, but he played in an era where there's 8 NBA teams. So let's be honest, he had a much better shot of winning every time. The defensive win shares are quite high for him, so there's just a lot of the analytics that are the dig up when he's on the floor. Other teams don't play as well or shoot as well, but there's an error thing that comes into this conversation as well. And there's a lot of players that won 8 rings on that set of Boston Celtics. So interesting stuff. I'll start with my number 5, which again falls into the banner of potentially an error enabling the stats. I actually went Will Chamberlain at number 5. Obviously, the lack of championships held him back, only getting the 2 in his tenure. But obviously, with the untouchable records of 50 points in a season average and 100 points in a game, and the leading the league in assists for a while, 22 career rebounds. Obviously, his greatest issue was he was a fantastic individual player, but then the team aspect didn't get him there as well, and also a bit of a journeyman. 4 different teams. I went Will at number 5.
Well, here's the good news for you. I had Will at number 4.
Okay.
Clearly, 100 points is iconic. Besides Kobe's 81, and LaMelo scoring 92 in high school. Don't forget that. All right? Don't forget that.
I did.
That obviously Will got triple digits. But you sort of and I did look at his stats obviously, and just like you said, only 2 rings. And you sort of wonder, if he didn't score 100, would we even be talking about him this high? Obviously again, it was a different era. And there's not that many stats obviously to sort of support some of his career in that sense back then, because they didn't track all these sort of stats that they did nowadays. So I guess it's a real hard one to sort of really pick some of these players that I guess were before our day. And ultimately, I guess, I'm curious, I guess, back then, Wilt drops 100. Did we even hear about that in Australia? You know what I mean?
Well,
Is it?
it's also who he drops 100 against. You know what I mean? Like, Kobe gets a little bit of a flack because he dropped it against a Toronto team that probably had Jalen Rose as the most recognizable player. Um, but yeah, like honestly, it's the same age as always, right? Like it's a bunch of white guys that work a second job playing the NBA in that era. So there's an element where, is the competition at the same tier? Like Wilt's clearly phenomenal, and you'd love to plop him into a current, generation to see how things play out. But unfortunately, he played against the guys that he played against, and were they as good as the average player is now? I don't think that's the case.
So who's at number 4?
For me, I went Hakeem Olajuwon, and I'm kind of surprised that you dropped him off your list. Obviously, getting the 2 championships in Jordan's absence, and you can make a case and say that if Jordan is around, that doesn't happen. I personally believe that there's no way that the Bulls go 8 straight. The burnout's got to be real. There's got to be some issues there. And there were lots of good players that we've talked about in previous settings of they got blocked by Jordan. And technically speaking, when that window opened to not be blocked by Jordan, well, Hakeem seized it 2 times in a row. So there's got to be some credit given there. Obviously averaged, excuse me, averaged essentially 20 and 10, very efficient on the field goal percentage, high impact on the win shares, and essentially like made a small market team in Houston quite relevant. Considering that in that generation, it was Boston, it was the Celtics, and then the Bulls. And the Bulls were an anomaly because they had one of the greatest players of all time. But he actually brought them into relevance as well. So I went with Hakeem at number 4.
Hakeem was a hard cut. It was a hard cut.
Yeah.
And I think besides the 2 rings, how many defensive players for years did he win? And I don't know, there's a fun fact. Where's your fun fact, Nick?
I don't have it. You know what? I feel like I've been letting everyone down on the fun facts. I don't see a defensive player of the year, but he was voted 9 times. Oh no, sorry, my apologies. 2-time defensive player of the year and 9-time on the defensive team.
You're another player that Hakeem sort of reminded me of, and obviously Hakeem did get the rings, was Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard,
Yes.
you could make an argument that he's somewhere knocking on the door of the top 5 or top 10. But he did get a ring finally when he was just sitting on the bench, I think, or coming off the bench at the Lakers. He was never able to lead a team in his prime in that sense. So, I guess, I can't fault your pick at 4 for Hakeem, especially since you had 1 extra slot. But I would rate him a little bit lower than obviously those 5 that I did put on my list. Because obviously at number 3, I had Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan is 3 on my all-time centers list. 5 rings, whole career spent at the Spurs. Just big fundamental. Obviously, he was never flashy, but he just won, and he was the core of the Spurs, the dynasty that was also like Tony Parker and Ginobili. Obviously, I rated Ginobili fairly high on my list, but it's his stats were never that great, 19 and 10 over the career and 3 assists. So he was never sort of a big stat guy, but he just showed up every night and obviously was able to really be a huge success and really put the Spurs on the map. Would we even be talking about the Spurs without Tim Duncan? That's a whole other story.
Well, you're talking about a player that essentially won in 3 different decades. Like they had a dynasty that lasted a very long period of time, whereas most dynasties are that you have 3 or 4 finals runs and then it's over. And versed a lot of good teams and played different roles on those, major role in the early finals runs, and then obviously takes a more of a sub role on the second one. And then when it gets to the last one, musters up the last bit of energy for that, but it was just a strong team. So
I think
I can't fault the pick.
I don't think Tim Duncan has ever missed the playoffs in his career.
Yeah, you know what? Based on, because they were always like a 50-win season or something pace as well.
And then when obviously he retired, then now pops back to the lottery and trying to develop all these young kids. Everyone said it was going to retire, but didn't happen.
Yeah, you probably I do remember that stats kind of circulating that they always made the playoffs, and I think they always won a playoff like game as well. Like they might have even won the majority of the rounds. Yeah, like look, his win percentage is massive. It's can't be stated. I won't labor the point. My third was where Bill Russell fell. I just feel, let's be honest, he went up against Wilt Chamberlain, and Wilt Chamberlain got 2 championships and Bill Russell got 11. And if we recognize the greatness of Wilt Chamberlain and how impressive he was offensively, and we hear all about Bill Russell's defensive prowess. Clearly that paid off, and clearly that had an impact for him to get 11 championships. It's a hard one because 15 and 25, I believe, no, sorry, 22 are impressive numbers. If you have those other recordings, that's pretty important too. Obviously the counter, that is my own counter, is it's definitely a bunch of white guys that are studying and working, on the weekend. But I just think that, it's sustained excellence. That man averaged 20 rebounds for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seasons. It's, they're pretty ungodly numbers that don't get touched as well.
I think, look, like I said, Bill Russell asked me 10 years ago, I would have said Bill Russell was like number one. He simply put the pure fact and stat that he obviously has won 11 rings. But I think slowly over time, I've been much more subjective on how I sort of qualify these all-time greats, especially in this center position. And unfortunately, those that I've never really seen play. I think in part, like I said at the start, maybe we should rate the players in the last 10 or 20 years that we've definitely seen play. And then you said, nah, let's go all time. And I was like, okay, sure. But the centers is obviously a position here where obviously like Wilt and like, Bill Russell, and no doubt probably one more pick on top 5 here that we've never really seen play, but we've heard how great they were. And that's really our sort of our impression of them, and whether that's sort of right or wrong, and obviously in comparison to what the league was in that sort of time.
I mean, look, we'll have good discussions maybe when it comes to season awards for this season, because Alusa can be relatively, present, and we've seen enough stuff and have enough information. But yeah.
Well, number two. I feel like we're probably going to agree now on the last two potentially.
I think we should.
But so number 2. Look, I'll just say it, Shaq. Okay, I put Shaq at number 2. I must admit, I didn't really want to put Shaq at number 2. But after sort of looking at everything that he done, 4 rings, 3 obviously with the Lakers, then he went over and got the ring with D-Wade at Miami. But probably more important, Shaq put the NBA on a map. I think Shaq was ultimately, he wasn't a guard obviously, but he was the torch was handed really from Jordan to Shaq. Shaq was the next big marketing thing that obviously took off before obviously Kobe was big, and before even like Allen Iverson and all these. Shaq came out as a rookie. Shaq attacked basketballs, Shaq jerseys, Shaq everything. Everyone knew who Shaq was. It was you talked about Shaq in the playground in primary school. And I think that along with and I think sometimes you sort of go, Tim Duncan obviously spent all these seasons at the Spurs, and you definitely sort of go, well, that's impressive, that's rewarding. But I think Shaq's sort of legacy in part was also the fact that he sort of bounced around, especially towards the tail end, in quite amusing ways. There's a meme out there, I think he's got all the colors of the rainbow, if you dress him up in all the singlets that he's worn over the course of his career. And just the impact, I guess, he had on the game, not only winning 4 rings and scoring a lot of points in his prime and being a huge offensive presence, but also obviously, just the impact he had on the sport of basketball.
So yeah, we're fortunate. I think it's been a while since we've agreed on one. Yeah, so Shaq's my number 2 as well. You mentioned the 4 rings. Another thing is that he also got to the finals, I think, another 2 times. One more with the Lakers when they failed to
get
Orlando 4 in a row, and obviously the one in Orlando. So, he was there. I think a lot of the times we look at rings and we don't factor in the fact that some players actually get to the finals a fair bit as well, and that is that's got to be given some consideration. You mentioned the team hopping. When he's in Orlando, he's dominant. He goes to the Lakers, he's still dominant. He goes to Miami, he's less dominant in terms of what we want out of his stats, but he's still dominant. He basically made that franchise instantly a contender, and then ends up going to Phoenix, and that definitely is where the spiral kind of happens. But you could make a case and say that Phoenix team actually had a legitimate shot with him. It mucked up their system of the run and gun, but they technically still had something going with him in there, and he still averaged a good double-double. And then obviously he gets sent to Cleveland as a weird last bid to convince LeBron that they're competitive. And then, is actually part of the Boston team that had a chance, that they were back to the finals, I'm pretty sure, that season, or they were in the Eastern Conference Finals. And he obviously has the foot injury that basically ceases the rest of the season. But, him as a backup center as well, probably similar to that Alonzo Mourning role in Miami. Yeah, and then as you said, the personality as well. They didn't give him a TV contract for no reason. And also, like, thing that doesn't get talked about, ignoring his basketball career, he seems to be a very active member in his communities and gives back a lot, and invests his money very well. And it's quite interesting because I think there's definitely a bit of a stereotype that he's a simple man and just plays basketball and he's a big giant, but went back and studied, owns a lot of different businesses, very active in donating to communities. So, just good all round center there.
I think so. 1 and 2 obviously tie in together to a certain extent, and I guess it's interesting. I think going sort of with Shaq, I think Kobe said it. Shaq could have been the greatest center of all time. 4 rings, is a great sort of achievement in itself, and puts him in sort of quite a great territory. But I think there was a lot of questions about Shaq's conditioning, especially after he left the Lakers, and ultimately his free throws, and ultimately just, he was always going to be that sort of bruiser in the paint, and that post game was always going to be his forte. But I guess that was it. That was nothing. There was nothing else. As he sort of became less athletic and got older, that it did sort of be a bit of an issue there, along with the injuries that sort of built up. But because I guess I never sort of really considered Shaq at 2. I thought of always sort of Shaq in the top 5, but probably a bit lower. But I guess to put this podcast together, I guess I had to be I guess accurate to sort of how I sort of ranked my players throughout each position. And I guess that's why Shaq obviously got to 2, but ultimately didn't get to 1, because at 1 we got Kareem, 6 rings with the Lakers. Obviously, again, I don't know how much commentary I can give you about Kareem, because he was obviously in a whole different era again. But he was obviously, his stats definitely show that he was averaging like 27 and 16 and 5 assists, 4 blocks. What the hell? It's like, this is like 2K numbers. But again, because we never saw it, because it was the 70s before I was even born. I think it's a little bit hard to sort of amplify that more. But I think the stats are there, the rings are there. Kareem, compared to all the other names on this list, is at number 1.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think he won a championship with Milwaukee, and then the other 5 with Lakers. So that's a big deal, considering that Milwaukee just won their first championship in 50 years. Clearly, that's something. I think longevity is probably the thing that struck out most about his career. He played from the age of 22 to 41, and you think about if he was a modern day player, he's a high school prospect, right? He comes out at 19, so he even gets an extra 3-4 years in the NBA. And I'm looking at the games played. He had a 1 dip where he played 65 games in a season, and 62, but the rest of them were, late 70s or 82. So considering his frame, considering the way that the style of basketball played, and considering the eras that he played in, just impressive across the board. Had his peak at 34.8 points. Had the peak at 17 rebounds, and you wonder if he had a bit more of a team-orientated mentality. Wilt put up those impressive numbers, but how much did Wilt suppress the team's success by getting those numbers? Where I think Kareem sort of maybe understood that a little bit more. And then like, I also played with our number 1 point guard, right? So there's probably an aspect there that benefits him too. So